Some of the most exciting stories that we enjoy are those where things turn really ugly for a while, but then work out in the end, right? So we love those narrow escapes. You know, someone's trapped or they're all trapped and it's just no way out, but then they find the way out, and we love those. Obviously, the bad part has to happen, that being trapped has to happen in order for the joy of the escape, right? Otherwise, there's no conflict, right? We've got to have conflict. We love when the bad guys are way outnumbered. As is so often the case. We were watching Lord of the Rings the other day, and and they built up this army of orcs and Uruk-hai. It's just huge army. Tens of thousands come against them, and they're just this little band. No chance. And we go, well, that's not fair, no way. But then the good guys are, still best them. And so that's the great ending, right? So we love happy endings, and we all know that. But most happy endings, as I'm saying, are the result of narrow escapes. They're the result of surpassing these unsurmountable odds, overcoming unsurmountable odds. Happy endings are the result of sometimes even tragic losses. There are tragic losses along the way, but they overcome those, and they still win. And even with the losses, we're happy at the end how it works out, because the good guys win, if you will. We like those kinds of stories, and like it or not, we're in the middle of one of these kinds of stories as a planet right now. For those of you watching this in the future, this is we're in October, the year 2020, and there's been this worldwide pandemic that caused by this flu virus, COVID-19, and that's the name of the illness. And so anyway, this has kind of started off earlier in the year, in February, kicked off, and so we've had this. It's been global, so there's been this pandemic. And there have been deaths in our own country, been over 200,000 at this point. Because of that, because of the danger, there have been restrictions placed on a lot of people, a lot of us, from the government. You got to wear a mask, you got to stay 6 feet apart. They closed down initially. They closed down restaurants and businesses and movie theaters and churches, and everything just got shut down. And then it's slowly being reopened again, but. Throughout it, we've seen what many people would call injustice because of these kinds of things. Lives have been turned upside down. The way that we knew life is different now, and that's why I'm making these videos, because some of you aren't able to get to church at this point in 2020. So this is where we are with the pandemic. So we're in the middle of this. These are some horrible odds we're facing right now, and then you throw in. Racial issues have cropped up again in our nation, certainly in the United States, and there have been shootings, and there have been protests, and there have been violence and looting and rioting and all this unrest, and on top of that, you throw in it's election year, and not just any election. This is like one of the weirdest elections, at least in my lifetime, and filled with conspiracy theories, about what's going on. And so there's all this division and unrest, and then this pandemic, and lives turned upside down, and injustice and shootings and protests, and then on top of it, last week Eddie Van Halen dies. And so there you go. This is 2020 for you. And so here we are, as I'm saying these things, we're all waiting for the resolution to this story, right? We're all waiting for the happy ending, and I'm praying it comes soon. But for now, we're at the part of the story, if you will, where things just look pretty bad. I'd love to put it some other way, but things look pretty bad no matter which direction you look. And that's where we find things in chapter 18 in the book of John. We're going through the study in the book of John. I've called it Abide. And where we are now in chapter 18, things are not looking good. Jesus has been arrested. So for a few chapters we've been talking about Jesus saying things are not going to go well, or things are going to look bad here, some bad stuff's on the way. Now it's happening. He's been arrested. Judas has betrayed him, as foretold. Peter has denied him, as Jesus also foretold, but now it's happened. The disciples have scattered. They've all kind of gone their own way. That wedding with tons of wine story, that was so long ago. The feeding of 5,000, everybody being pretty happy with Jesus, was so long ago. Even the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, with the palm branches and all of that, hit my laptop, was that was only about a week ago in real time there, but it's like ancient history from where they are now. It's so far away, and you've probably experienced those kinds of things in your own life. When things are going horrible, even though you may have had a great thing happen recently, it still seems so long ago, because this badness is just kind of taken over, and that's where we are right now in the story. When the part of the story where they're facing, the good guys, if you will, are facing these unsurmountable odds, or is it insurmountable? Insurmountable odds. And there have been tragic losses along the way. Jesus is on trial, and he's been arrested by men who wanted him dead, and they brought him now before a couple other guys who also want him dead. Annas and Caiaphas would be happy to see Jesus go, and so talk about an unfair trial. It's all unjust, and then things get really bad. So what I want to do is read this scripture for you, and I've just got to pull this up because I took it off of my sermon notes to make room. For those of you, when we do this live, I'm going to be doing this live on Sunday. We're back inside, which I'm really excited about, which means hopefully I can show a movie clip. So I'm going to show the movie version of this from the book of John. If you haven't seen that, I encourage you to see that. It's on YouTube for free. You can watch it. But this is where things pick up. John 18, verse 28 says, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium." That's like a courtroom. "And it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' They answered and said to him, 'If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you.' Then Pilate said to them, 'You take him and judge him according to your law.' Therefore the Jews said to him, 'It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death,' that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. He would have died of being stoned to death, but he's going to be crucified instead. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered him, 'Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?' Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here.' Pilate therefore said to him, 'Are you a king then?' Jesus answered, 'You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, 'I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews?' Then they all cried again, saying, 'Not this man, but Barabbas.' Now Barabbas was a robber." Going into chapter 19 here. "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' and they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, 'Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him.' Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man!' Therefore when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' Pilate said to them, 'You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.' The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God.' Therefore when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium, and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?' Jesus answered, 'You could have no power at all against me, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin.' From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.' When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king! But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him! Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. And we're going to pick up from the next point there next week. But I wish you could see this clip, because it's the drama as it's acted out. Much better than what I just did. I didn't really attempt to act that out, but even if I did, it wouldn't be much more dramatic than that. But you can see the malice in their faces, the religious leaders, as they cry out, Crucify him, crucify him. I'm sure many of you have seen Jesus movies, and they're pretty much always the same. And the way that they act that is just so angry and violent, and they really want to do away with him. But this is their moment of triumph. Okay, this is evil's moment of triumph, at least from their perspective in that moment. They've been obsessed with killing Jesus. These religious leaders have been obsessed with killing Jesus since they met him, and now their dreams are coming true. They tried to stump him and embarrass him in front of the crowds with questions about the law, and that had failed. They tried to arrest him, and he'd always escape. They showed up at the Feast of Tabernacles, if you remember back in chapter 7. They show up at the Feast of Tabernacles where Jesus went secretly. They show up there to kill him. But once again, he escapes. And then finally now, Judas, one of his own, has opened up a door for them. And so the time is right for them to get rid of this troublemaker, this blasphemer, this threat to their authority, and to have him crucified. So evil gets its way. So it would seem, at least, if the story ended here, right, which we'll get into the next couple of weeks. But for now, this is where we are with it. It's just like, it's looking bad. It's looking really bad, just like 2020 is looking bad. This moment here is just looking so sad and sour. If the gospel story ended here, or we'd be like, it's the worst story. It'd be like one of Shakespeare's tragedies, more so, right? It would be a tragic story. Now, one of the things I want to point out this week, just because this is where we are with this, I want to point out the lengths that these, in particular, the Jewish religious leaders were willing to go to have Jesus killed. We know that they wanted him killed. They had for a long time wanted to have this man killed, but they're willing to be so hypocritical in order to get it done. They're willing to bend and bow to all kinds of things. The first thing they do is they drop off Jesus at a Gentile court. That's Pilate's court. And then they stay outside so that they're not defiled, right? They're going to celebrate the Passover, and so they don't want to be defiled by going into the Gentiles' court. I mean, gross. So they won't go in there. Also that they can be clean, ceremonially clean, if you will, to celebrate the Passover. Now, of course, the Passover is a celebration of a time when God delivered the Jews from the Gentiles, right? The Egyptians. So Passover celebration, God has delivered the Jews from the Gentiles. So they want to celebrate that. In the meantime, the Jews are handing over God to the Gentiles. I'd never until I wrote it this week, I hadn't picked up on that twist. And I don't think I'm the first one to notice that. I just hadn't seen it in the commentaries or anything like that. But that was, what an ironic twist. I mean, you can grab the irony in this story. You could get a spoon into it and dip some out. That's the first spot. There's so much of this that goes on through the story I want to point out, but that's the first thing. Just that they're ready to celebrate Passover, in a time when God had delivered the Jews from the Gentiles, and now the Jews are delivering God unto the Gentiles. It's just such an awful twist. The other thing is that they want to observe their laws, which they're supposed to do, but here they are. They really want to observe their God-given laws in the midst of pushing for a crooked trial. They know it's crooked, resulting in the execution of an innocent man. And so here's an example, once again, so clearly, of law keeping without an ounce of love. So they are being real particular to the letter of the law, but there's no love in it at all. And this is the kind of thing that and this is why we remember them as Pharisees, and we might even refer to some people these days as Pharisees, because this is what religion can do. Not just Judaism, but any religion can do this. Christianity has done this, where we can get really into law but little love in the midst of it. It just becomes following the rules, right? And so these men that, hey, we're keeping the law. We're staying away from Gentiles before the Passover. We're not going to defile ourselves that way. We're law abiders. In the same time, they are ready to execute an innocent man in the midst of this crooked trial, rigged from the get-go. And so this is when John talks about being in darkness. And Jesus called them blind, when he heals the blind men, or heals the blind man. And then he refers to the spiritual leaders at that time as blind, that they thought they could see, which is what made them blind. And, this is something that religion can do. We have to be very careful about that, there are expectations God gives. We can call it law. We can call it Jesus law even. The way that we're meant to treat one another, and the things that Paul lists in his letters. But it's possible to keep those things without love. And Paul himself is the one, this is what's read off at just about every wedding. 1 Corinthians 13, right, where love is kind, and love is this, and love is that, and without love, we're resounding gongs and all that kind of stuff. Love has to be there. Otherwise we just have what these men had, which is keeping law without love goes against the purpose of God-given law, certainly. So now something you may have picked up on as I mentioned there as I was reading it is that the Jewish men they've captured Jesus, they've arrested him. Why not just stone him to death like they later do with Stephen? Stephen had no trial, really. He wasn't brought before Pilate or anybody like that. According to Jewish historians, the Jewish people, they're oppressed by the Roman Empire. They're under control of the Roman Empire at this point. They're not a sovereign nation. And they'd been stripped of their ability to carry out capital punishment, supposedly about 40 years earlier. This is according to Jewish writers like Josephus and others. So that's why they said, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. It's not lawful. They're big on law when they can hand this off onto someone else. So they needed Rome to help anyway. They needed Rome to help them carry this out. They didn't feel they could just do this themselves. And it's not just in order to keep a Roman law. Obviously, they wouldn't have been too concerned about that. But another reason that they're doing this is they want to pawn Jesus off onto the Gentiles, onto Pilate in particular. Because Jesus was hugely popular. The triumphant entry had just happened like a week before, yes? He came in, the palm branches, everybody excited about Jesus. Now you take a figure like that and execute him the following week, publicly. You're not going to make a lot of friends with those people, and it's possible they would have had a riot on their hands, and they knew that. Matthew mentions that, I believe. They would have been in real trouble with the people if they'd execute. We've had some riots here in our own nation, and they're around the world for various reasons at this point. It's just everybody's protesting, rioting, but this could have easily turned into a major riot if the Jewish leaders had themselves stoned Jesus. So at this point, they can hand him off, let Pilate make the decision, so that it's on Pilate. They can walk away without blood on their hands, literally. No blood on their hands. They're still going to be okay with the people, because look what Rome has done. This is Rome's decision. So no riots that they have to deal with. And even if the people had rioted, it might have been okay because it's against Rome, right? It's not against the Jewish leaders. If there'd been a riot, well, it's against Rome for making such a horrible decision about Jesus. That didn't happen, but just kind of going through some of the politics behind this whole story. It's pretty sick. So they want to pawn off Jesus onto Pilate, and so Pilate now has to deal with him, and he starts asking him some questions, and the reason that they can hand him off to Pilate, and the reason that Pilate has to deal with it, he can't just say, which he tries, hey, try him according to your own law. But they said, but he said he was a king. So now it is Rome's problem, because Rome has to take that seriously, right? That's a potential threat against the empire. There's no king but Caesar, and now this guy says he's a king. Well, we have to look at that and take it seriously. So Pilate knew he couldn't dismiss such a charge. He had to deal with it. The Romans, of course, had replaced the kings of Israel. Israel hadn't had a true king in like 400 years, not since being carried off to Babylon. But they had the puppet kings like Herod, and Rome's actually in charge. In fact, Rome got rid of kings in any true sense in Judea, and then put in these governors like Pilate was. And so Pilate's the real authority, and then the Herods and these kinds of characters, Agrippa later on, these guys are just, they're puppets under Rome. They don't really have much authority. So Rome's the real authority. They have to look at the case and then perhaps carry out this execution, which they do end up doing. But in order for Pilate to even look at it, it had to be in Rome's interest. And it is. When someone claimed to be a king, well, boy, we can't be having that because there's only one king, and that's Caesar. So at least on paper, this was a threat. So Pilate has to deal with it. And but all the same, we can see as you go through the story, Pilate looking for an out. He doesn't want it. I don't think Pilate wanted to deal with this. I don't think, as he's going through, he keeps saying, I find no guilt in him. This is not a clear-cut case, you guys. At the same time, I'm sure he doesn't want to drag it out. Pilate, too, doesn't want to have a riot on his hands. Right? That's why I'm saying that so much of this is political. He's got to think in these terms. It's not just a spiritual matter. For Pilate, and for the Jewish authorities, they're thinking politically. What can we do here? The people will handle it this way, or not do this, or do that, or it'll be seen this way. And so Pilate doesn't want a riot on his hands. That's why he later literally washes the blood off his hands. This is not to do with me. Don't get all worked up and show up at my front door, with whatever, dumping stuff on my front porch in protest. Don't come after me. But this is, again, the whole reason that Jesus has come. Is for this moment. So it's going to happen. But so Pilate has to deal with him. Jesus comes, he speaks the truth, and the truth doesn't get him off the hook because he is a king. He's not the kind of king that they're worried, that they need to be worried about in that sense, but they still are. I think Pilate was threatened by him, anybody who would claim to be, an authority above him, and the Jewish authorities were certainly threatened by him. So anyway, then Pilate asks his famous question, his philosophical question, what is truth? Which is one of those questions people tend to ask when they don't want to deal with truth. Just let's define that. It's more a rhetorical question. As you'll even notice with Pilate, he doesn't stick around and ask follow-ups on that. What is truth? I say truth is this. What say you? Pilate doesn't do any of that. He's just like, oh, well, what is truth? Like if I were to ask one of my kids to take out the garbage, and then my kid looks at me and says, what does it mean to take out the garbage really? Right? Trying to redefine something and just spend some time talking about nonsense. So that's, I think, kind of Pilate's tactic here, and is he wants to avoid truth. And so to avoid truth, you start asking questions like, what is truth? And I think certainly we've been seeing that kind of thing, in our own generation here, with people perhaps not wanting to deal with what truth is, and so just let's talk about truth in a way that doesn't actually define it, but keeps it wavy gravy so that we can kind of do what we want. Pilate at best was looking at something like that. I think really he's just, I don't want to deal with truth. Again, he doesn't ask any follow-up. So the conversation kind of ends at this point with Pilate ready to let Jesus go home. Hey, I say we send this guy home. Be done with this. He's not guilty. But then he plays another political move. And this is pretty clever. He tells the Jewish people, he says, "But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you King of the Jews?" Then they all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber, it says. So what he does here is he throws the ball. This is political volleyball. And so he's just bumped it back over the net. Now they've got to deal with Jesus, right? They show up. Here, Pilate, you deal with Jesus. They bump Jesus over the net. Now Pilate says, "Back at you," right? Now you guys, and so he puts it now in their court. You guys make a choice, right? The way he does it is kind of clever. You guys make a choice. Hey, out of my greatness and kindness, I'm going to release to you a prisoner at the Passover. I do it every year. It's one of the things that makes Rome so great and why you guys should be so glad to be part of our empire. Who do you choose? And so then it's back on them to make the choice. Again, the blood can be on their hands. Very interesting. Again, how that kind of worked out. So they choose Barabbas. Most of us know this story. They choose Barabbas instead of Jesus. Now the word used to describe him here is robber. Mark tells us in his gospel that this man Barabbas had committed murder as part of a rebellion. So it's much more than a guy, than Aladdin, running through the streets grabbing a free apple here and there and then being crucified for it or put in jail for it. This man had murdered people as part of a rebellion. He was, to Rome's eyes, he would have been a terrorist. That's a modern day word, a terrorist. Perhaps to the Jewish people, a hero. That's how those things often work, right? And so anyway, he's a violent man, a rebel, as Mark tells us. Gives us a little more information about Barabbas. It's helpful. This man had murdered people as part of a rebellion against Rome. So that's who this guy is, and that's who they choose to release, Barabbas. The non-threat, which is Jesus, gets crucified, while the actual threat walked the streets that day. That's crazy. And that's where the kinds of choices people will make when they're blind to their ambition, blind to, I've got to do this no matter what. They've got to get Jesus no matter what, and they'll put a maniac, like Barabbas, back out on the streets, a killer. So again, this hypocrisy just plays out in these guys as they're doing this thing. They're making a case against a man who isn't a threat at all to Rome. And in the meantime, they're releasing a man who clearly has proven to be a threat to Rome. So the terrorist goes free. The innocent man goes to his death. And again, this is, kind of taking a picture of it outside of, the story that we all know so well as part of the gospel. But if we stand outside and look at the story, you could see, and has been noted, this is the dark side of where religion and power and nationalism all intertwine with each other. We live in a country that said, hey, we're going to keep the state and the church separate. Church and state, there's a separation there, and neither one is going to influence the other. And this is the reason why. Of course, it happens anyway, but this is one of the reasons why, because after centuries and centuries and centuries of seeing these kinds of things, it's the dark side of what happens when those things come together. And we see that in this story, just religion, just a religious mindset, and zealousy for that religion and its concepts and ideas and goals, and then you throw in nationalism, which is all for country and all for. And the Romans had that in their, for Rome, and the Jewish people had that for Israel. And then you mix all that with religion, you get a real mess. So that was going on in the story here. And so then we get into chapter 19, which is where, Jesus is whipped where he's tortured with this crown of thorns, where he's beaten, where they mock him with the purple robe. The purple robe was a sign of majesty, and so they're mocking his claim of kingship here. And this, I've got to note, this is all on Rome. This part, okay, so the Jewish authorities aren't there saying purple robe, crown of thorns, this many lashes. This is all on Rome. Rome were pretty good at this kind of thing, as Christians came to find in the coming years. Romans were masters of torture, and they thought of all kinds of horrible, evil ways to torture and mock somebody and be entertained by it. Right? It became their entertainment, of course, with the Colosseum and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, this is what's going on, and we have to remember that this is the world Jesus came to save. Right? God so loved the world, which includes these Romans mocking and torturing him. John told us at the beginning, the light shone in the darkness, but the darkness did not comprehend it. And here's that so clearly, that they didn't comprehend that light. So now Pilate brings out this battered Jesus, right, in front of the crowd, with the robe to mock him, the crown to mock him. And they remind Pilate of the crime. Hey, this guy says he's the Son of God, which it says made Pilate all the more afraid, which is kind of an interesting thing also, because for one, it says Pilate was already afraid. So the whole thing is bothering Pilate, and now it makes him more afraid, and there's some reasons for that. But he's already concerned about a possible riot. He's being pressured to condemn a man that he can't find any cause of guilt for, but the pressure keeps coming, right? He's being pressured to go against his conscience, which is to set the guy free. And as the other gospel writers tell us, Matthew tells us even, at this point in the story, there's a message that comes in from Pilate's wife saying, hey, have nothing to do with this man. I had a horrible dream. Don't deal with it. So Pilate's got all this going on. And now they add in, this kind of new charge. Not only is he king, but he claims to be the Son of God. Now Pilate, being a Roman, would have been, any religion at all would have been that there are gods, and that there are many gods, and that those gods, like the Greeks believed also, would sometimes take human form. And so now they're throwing out the possibility to Pilate, at least in his mind. I don't think they necessarily were doing that to manipulate him, but certainly to the Roman mind, there's a possibility here that I am going to condemn a god in human form, and I will be so toast for that. The vengeance will be unbelievable from this, if this turns out to be a god in human form. And so now he's got all of that stuff playing in his mind, and I can't imagine, I don't want to say poor Pilate, like we should go easy on the guy, because he did what he did, but I can put myself in his shoes perhaps for a moment and try to imagine all that's playing. The pressure at that moment, the stress of this moment would have been horrible. And that's what Pilate's dealing with. He's fearful. He's trying to deal with his own conscience. He's got pressures coming in. It's political. It's going to get even worse for him here. Because the Jewish people at this point, the authorities, get really, really desperate. In football, at the end of the game, or at the end of the half sometimes, the quarterback will throw what's called a Hail Mary. There's a kind of a story about that. It started in Notre Dame College, which is a Catholic college, and so anyway, it's a desperate pass. It's not to anyone really in particular. It's just a million miles down the field as far as he can huck it, and just hope that one of their guys catches it and it scores a touchdown. It's a desperate move. They got nothing else we can do in 2 seconds left on the clock, kind of a throw. So they just and toss this thing. It's a Hail Mary because the Catholics believe, that Mary intercedes, and so it would take Mary's intercession for anybody, for this to come to any good, is where the phrase came from, for those of you interested. But Anyway, the Jewish authorities here basically toss out, this is their Hail Mary in the trial. It's desperate because Pilate keeps coming back saying, I find no guilt. I beat him. We've done a little mocking, and I still don't find anything wrong with the guy. I think I'm just going to set him free. And so now here's their Hail Mary. They say, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Now, this statement, of course, goes against everything that was Jewish, which hated Rome and hated their king and hated Caesar, right? It goes against their laws. It goes against their history. It goes against the oppression that they were in and had been in for 400 plus years. It goes against their hopes. Their hopes were to get out from under Caesar. In fact, the Jewish cry, rather than saying something about being Caesar's friend, would have been, Caesar will never be our friend. We want any king but Caesar. Would have been really their belief. But instead, they're appealing to Caesar and appealing to his authority, and again trying to frighten Pilate into making a decision that sides with Caesar, lest he be now, so Pilate could be in trouble with Caesar. He could be in trouble with a God in human form. He could be in trouble with the Jewish people who will riot if they don't get their way. He's going to be in trouble with his wife because he ignores her. So anyway, but this is, imagine them saying, as they come to say, we have no king but Caesar, is one of the most hypocritical things ever. That statement is, for the Jewish people to have ever said we have no king but Caesar goes against everything you read about them in the Old Testament, their whole story, right? And so they're willing to give up their loyalty. They're willing to say things that they should never say. They've gone against themselves. They've gone against Israel. They've gone against all the Jewish people. They've gone against Yahweh himself in order to get this guy sentenced and executed. It's so desperate and so underhanded, so dirty, so disloyal. We talk about Judas's betrayal and Peter's denial, and these guys, it's just so slimy. One of the saddest things about it too is just that from the Jewish leaders, okay, who get their way, they get their way. Jesus is led away to be crucified, and we'll talk about the crucifixion next week. But these men showed none of the reserve of Pilate. Pilate, he keeps saying, I need a proper case. I need some. I can't just go on this. I don't find him guilty. So Pilate, though he ends up saying, okay, carry him off, gives the order, but he showed a lot of reserve. Like, he didn't just start there, right? It took him a long time of nope, and then questioning Jesus, and then Jesus giving a little response, and then giving no response, and him having very little to work with, and then finally going, all right, man, you guys are just, this is the worst. But he'd shown reserve. The Jewish leaders, no reserve about this whole thing. Crucify him. Judas, and we don't get the rest of Judas's story in John, but in the other Gospels, we read that Judas, had been given money to do this, the 30 pieces of silver, which he comes back, throws back at them. He doesn't want it. What he's done isn't worth it. And then he goes and he kills himself. We know nothing about Judas and, being saved or anything like that from this. But we do see regret from Judas. Judas regrets what he's done. Peter regrets what he's done. And Pilate showed great reserve in what he would do. But from the Jewish authorities, we get none of that. For all we know, they slept soundly that night. They had the best night's sleep they'd ever had. They finally got done what they'd wanted to have done for a few years, which was to have this man killed. So for them, no regrets. Now, why focus on all this, 2,000 years after the fact? Why bring all this up about the Jewish leaders? Do I think we need to somehow hold a grudge against them. They were judged long ago, and that wasn't my or your job to do anyway. So that's all been dealt with. The story and the people involved in it, dealt with. Nor do we bring all this up and the political aspects of it all to say, well, Jewish people and Roman people, are a real problem, and so we should be mad at them just in general. That's ridiculous. We don't need to be boycotting hummus or spaghetti, anything like that. That's all, again, in the past, dealt with, done. The reason to bring this up for me is to say, as I did last week, there was a story about Judas's failure, a story about Peter's failures. It said a lot about failure. This week, this story says a lot about the blindness of men. The blindness of, in particular, religious men. And again, it says a lot about what happens when these forces come together. Religion and power and nationalism. When they all intermingle with politics, and all that stuff comes together. People can be very hypocritical, all of us. I would raise my hand first to say, I'm not 100% this way or 100% that way, or, and so anyway, because you have all these different things trying to kind of blending in together and sorting it out. But I've had a hard time, as many have, ever trying to fathom how some of the atrocities of history have happened. Things like the Crusades, the witch hunts, the Holocaust, slave trade, even Manifest Destiny, which growing up was presented to me as one of the most amazing, wonderful things that ever happened. But the reality of it, was fairly brutal and awful and selfish and racist and all kinds of things. But it was all these things are a blending of religion and politics and and all that kind of stuff. And so, true, none of those events have anything to do with us living today. But these are the things we always have to learn from. I'm not going to say any more than that, but just these are the things, history of things we have to learn from. And so this is another historical moment, as recorded in Scripture, one of the most important moments of all time, right? And so just seeing what was going on there, for us to just say, oh, that was some Jewish people and some Roman people 2,000 years ago, and boy, that's what happens when they come together. Or that it was just, it was all preordained by God, or whatever else we might want to say about it. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time. If people, especially as I'm speaking to and about Christians, if we don't learn from history, we repeat these same kinds of errors of total blindness. So anyway, that's the dark side of this tale. It's a pretty dark side of it. I mean, it's a gloomy, man, I'm sorry for this today. This is just the passage that it is. I didn't write it. And if I'd kept on reading, it's, they're going to kill him. That's the next part, which we understand to be of, God has used us for mighty things, but it's still just, it's a gloomy part of the story. But seeing all that goes on inside that, yeah, it's pretty yucky stuff. But let's get to the bright side, which is we know the end of the story. Jesus is killed. He is buried. We'll look at that next week, but he rises from the tomb. And he overcomes death by death and wins the ultimate victory over sin and death. But things looked pretty dark there for a while, right? That's what we're looking at here. Things look pretty dark. Many of us know that verse from the Psalms. There may be weeping. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning, right? We know that one, and that's the story of the gospel. That's the bright side to all of this. That's not included in the passage we looked at today, but we have to look at that bigger picture, or it's just a gloomer. We have to see this is the story of Jesus in the gospel. Things get dark, but then light follows. Weeping followed by joy. In this moment that we look at, this part of the picture, this part of the story, it's just a narrow part of it, powerful, but dark. And the evil forces are getting their way. And it's not just. And it's malicious. And it's corrupt. And it's underhanded. And it's just ugly. And so this is their thought. Hey, we're doing it. The religious leaders, like I said, we got it done. And their thoughts are, as Caiaphas had understood his prophecy to mean, we get rid of this guy, and then it's for the sake of the whole nation. So this movement will fizzle. This branch, heretical branch of Judaism, will fizzle. And Peter and the boys, that's all going down. We don't have to worry about that once we get rid of Jesus. And so that's the hope. But God takes this moment, and he, as he's always had planned to do, and he flips it. He takes this awful thing and he flips it upside down so that it's for our salvation and it's for his glory. I mean, if you'd ever said, to anybody, and this is how the Jews still today can't understand the gospel, that God dying is for his glory, that's really hard for many to fathom. How can dying be for God's glory? It's so opposite what you would imagine. You wouldn't define glory necessarily as, kind of giving over and being crucified. That's exactly what it was, and that's exactly what God did with us. And he took this awful, dark moment and used it for the most wonderful thing in all history. And many of you, I'm sure, can attest, as I could too, to stories in our own lives of when things have been dark, things of, tragedy, loss, facing the insurmountable odds, and yet God makes something good even of that. There's perhaps a very long part of the journey that's dark, but he can get us to a place where he uses that for his glory, for his goodness. And many of us know this verse from Romans speaks to that very thing, and we know that all things. I know this is for many people, this is like a life verse, right? You hold on to Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Let me keep reading. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that they might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified, and whom he justified, these he also glorified. This tells us in Romans 8 that we as believers will be glorified no matter what else happens, no matter else what goes on in our lives, in the world, we will be glorified. Predestined, he called, he justified, and 100% of those he glorifies. That's us. That's where we're headed. That's the light at the end of this tunnel. As I started off with what's going on, around the world right now, pandemics and protests and politics, the three Ps. All that's going on this year, and in wild ways, and so we can just look at those things and get overwhelmed. But the reminder here is that I want us to remember, even as we go through such a dark part of this story too, that it ends in glory. It ends for Jesus in glory, eternal glory, and we have that same glory to look forward to. Those he justified, he also glorified. Every single one of us will be glorified, and that's the story for us. Even though there's injustice in the world now, we will be glorified. Even though we may die poor, we will be glorified. Even though there may be wars around the world, we will be glorified. Even though some of us start getting arthritis at 45, ow, we will be glorified. I have to talk to my parents about when they started getting arthritis. My mom, but 45? Are you kidding me? I think it's having to do with the COVID thing and a bad diet. But anyway, I will be glorified even so, and that's the truth, and that's what I have to hang on to. And so we don't want to allow ourselves to become despairing, and it's such an easy thing to do, especially this time in 2020. we can't allow ourselves to despair over our own circumstances at any point. We can't allow ourselves to despair over whatever happens in this election. We're less than a month away from electing a president, either the same one we've had or a new one, and whichever way it goes, half the country are going to be really upset. And but we can't allow ourselves to despair either way that turns out, because we will be glorified. We can't allow ourselves to despair at the threat of COVID-19, nor can we allow ourselves to despair at all these unwanted repercussions and restrictions and things like that of COVID-19. Either way, we can't. We don't want to allow ourselves to despair. I know that when I say can't, what I mean is God has something better for us. He has a promise for us to hold on to, which is that we will be glorified. And there'll come a day when truly this is, and we've all said this to ourselves, and had other people say it. We've seen it in movies. We've heard it in sermons, But one day we'll all look back on this, and it's not that we'll laugh, but we'll look back on this with a whole different perspective. And most of us can attest to that, even in this life. Things that are difficult and terrible, even, but then we can look back on it afterwards and go, and have a different perspective. The most obvious analogy is, women who give childbirth, going through childbirth, and Jesus even uses this example. There's the pain, but then it's forgotten as soon as that baby arrives, and that's where we'll be when we reach that moment of glory. Then all that we faced here, it'll be as nothing. It'll be as nothing, and the sooner we can adopt that perspective now, and keep it in our minds, the less likely we will be despairing and discouraged and depressed and other things. So anyway, to remember, that's where this journey is headed. No matter what craziness it looks like, our destiny is to be glorified. Your destiny is to be glorified as a believer in Christ. That's where you're headed. No matter what. No matter what. That's where you're going. That's where I'm going. And we have to remind ourselves of that, remind each other of that. I need people to remind me of that. You get into all these things that are going on and forget it. No. Beyond all of the worries and concerns, we will be glorified. That's a promise. And so I want to leave you with that and pray that it encourages you. Write it down somewhere. Write it on your, some people tape notes, on their computers so that they see things. That's one to remember. I will be glorified. No matter what happens, I will be glorified. And see what God does with that perspective. I'm encouraged this week to be thinking about it, even as I preach to this computer screen. And I can see myself, I'm just preaching to me, Remind yourself, Dave, you will be glorified no matter what happens. So be encouraged by that. Be blessed, and look forward to joining again with you next week, God willing. Until then, just enjoy that truth. You will be glorified no matter what. Amen? Amen.